Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. Ready to dive into something I think we've all dealt with?
Always up for a challenge. What are we tackling today?
Conflict management. And specifically, we'll be looking at it from a leadership angle.
Oh, interesting. Always a relevant topic.
Right, and never a dull moment. So for this deep dive, we're going to be using an article from Talent Acquisition and People Strategy, Insights and Advice. It's called 5 Essential Conflict Management Skills Every Leader Needs to Master.
This is UnitiQ. Please subscribe to this channel and like the video. It is important for us and for YouTube algorithms.
5. Huh. Well, that sounds promising.
I know, right?
Yeah.
Like a toolkit for those tricky situations. So let's picture this, right? You've got this project deadline, like looming, the whole team's feeling the pressure, and then you've got the project manager who's like, we need more hours, everyone work late.
Oh, yeah, I can feel the tension already. Been there a few times, I have to admit.
So relatable, right? And today we're gonna figure out how to deal with those kinds of situations, maybe even like turn them into something good.
Oh, I like that. Turning conflict into an advantage. Now, it's funny how we often see conflict as a bad thing, but disagreements, they're kind of natural, especially in workplaces that are like dynamic and, have a lot of creative energy flowing.
So you're saying like a team that never argues, maybe that's not necessarily a good sign.
Yeah, it could mean that people aren't really engaged or they're afraid to speak their minds, which kind of stifles innovation,
Wow, that's a really interesting perspective. So a little bit of debate is actually healthy.
Exactly. It can spark creativity, lead to better solutions. The key is to make sure those disagreements don't turn toxic,
Right, because when conflict gets out of control, it can really damage morale and productivity.
Exactly. It's like, imagine a tiny crack in a bridge. Might seem insignificant at first, right?
Yeah.
But if it's ignored, well, eventually the whole thing can collapse.
Okay, that's a powerful image. So conflict, it's inevitable, and it can be both good and bad. The question is, how do we manage it?
Well, that's where those 5 essential skills come in. And the foundation of it all, the most crucial one, active listening.
Active listening, more than just hearing what someone's saying, right?
Right. It's about genuinely trying to understand where they're coming from, their perspective, their feelings.
I think we've all had those conversations where you just know the other person isn't really listening. Super frustrating.
Tell me about it. Active listening means hearing everyone, not just those directly involved in the conflict, and doing it without judgment. Think of it like putting on your detective hat, gathering clues before jumping to any conclusions.
I like that. A conflict detective.
Right. And, a simple but powerful tip. The article suggests actually paraphrasing what the other person is saying, like to make sure you really get it.
That's a good idea. I never thought of that. But what happens when, you've listened, you've heard everyone out? What's the next step?
Well, then it gets really interesting. The article talks about digging deeper, finding the root causes of the conflict, like peeling back the layers of an onion.
So it's not just about dealing with the argument on the surface, it's about figuring out what's driving it.
Exactly. So let's go back to that stressed project team we were talking about. Instead of just trying to, calm everyone down about a deadline, ask yourself, how often does this kind of conflict happen? What triggers it? Who's usually involved? What specific behaviors or comments make things worse?
Wow. Those are some really thought-provoking questions. I bet if I looked back on past conflicts, I'd see some patterns I hadn't noticed before.
You probably would. And by identifying those patterns, you can start addressing the bigger issues. Maybe it's a lack of clarity in roles, communication breakdown, or even a personality clash that needs to be managed.
This is really making me think about conflict in a whole new way.
That's great. And once you have a grasp of those root causes, you can find more effective ways to resolve the conflict. And more importantly, prevent similar conflicts from happening again.
So we've talked about active listening, digging deeper. What's the next skill on the list?
This one is all about emotional intelligence. EQ for short.
EQ. I've heard of it, but I'm not sure I really understand what it means. Practically, I mean. How does it apply to conflict?
Well, think about it. Conflicts are emotional situations. People get frustrated, angry, even hurt. If a leader doesn't have the emotional intelligence to navigate those feelings, things can go downhill fast.
Right, like a manager who gets defensive when someone disagrees with them.
Yeah.
That's not going to help.
A leader with high EQ, though, they can recognize their own emotional triggers, manage their responses. They can also empathize with the other person, understand their feelings, even if they don't agree with their point of view.
So it's about taking a moment, understanding your own emotions and the emotions of the other person.
Exactly. and that can de-escalate the situation and make it easier to have a productive conversation. Like imagine a team member is stressed about a tight deadline. Instead of dismissing them, a leader with high EQ might say, I understand you're feeling overwhelmed. It sounds like you're concerned about it.
That's so much better. It shows you're actually listening and trying to see their perspective.
Right. And that kind of empathy can go a long way. It builds trust and creates a more positive and productive environment.
Okay, so we've talked about active listening, understanding the root causes of conflict, and that whole EQ thing. Seems like there's a lot more to conflict management than just, dealing with the argument itself.
Yeah, it's more about creating a work culture where disagreements are like opportunities for growth, not something to be afraid of.
I like that. So let's say we've done all that. We've listened, we've dug deep, we've kept our cool. What's next? How do we actually resolve the conflict?
That's where the practical skills come in. How to have those constructive conversations. It's like you've gathered all the evidence, now it's time to present your case.
Okay, I'm with you. So what does a constructive conversation actually look like? In a conflict situation, I mean.
It starts with choosing the right format. Like, do you need one-on-one meetings? Or maybe a mediated discussion with a neutral third party? Or even a team workshop if it's a bigger issue. The article emphasizes that you got to tailor the approach, depending on the specific conflict and the people involved.
Makes sense. No one-size-fits-all solution, right?
Right, and once you've got the format down, the next thing is transparency. Be clear about the issues, encourage everyone to speak openly. Remember, the goal is not to attack each other, but to really understand everyone's perspective.
Yeah, and that's where that emotional intelligence comes in again, right? Being able to acknowledge the emotions in the room, it can make a big difference.
Huge difference. The article gives an example of a sales manager who really struggles with criticism. Turns out it's because of something that happened in the past. Understanding those sensitivities, it can really help create a more supportive dialogue.
We all have our own baggage, right?
We do. And recognizing that, both in ourselves and in others, that's key to creating a safe space for honest conversation.
So let's say we've had those conversations, we've aired our grievances, hopefully we've reached some kind of understanding. What then? Just shake hands and move on.
Not quite. Now it's time to talk about setting boundaries and establishing new norms. It's like you've just cleaned up a big mess, right? Now you need to put systems in place to prevent the same mess from happening again.
I love that analogy, so practical. What are some concrete steps for setting those boundaries?
The article talks about three main things: defining new rules of engagement, outlining clear boundaries, and clarifying expectations. Let's say the conflict was about missed deadlines. You might create new rules like submitting project timelines in writing or scheduling regular check-in meetings, maybe even using a shared online calendar for milestones.
It's about creating structure and a clarity to prevent those misunderstandings from happening again.
Exactly. And then, outlining clear boundaries is about being really specific about what behavior is acceptable and what's not. Maybe that means setting guidelines for how people communicate, like the tone they use, or establishing protocols for disagreements, or even outlining consequences if someone's being disrespectful.
Like drawing a line in the sand, saying this is where we stand.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And finally, clarifying expectations is about things like positive reinforcement, recognizing and rewarding good behavior, but also outlining consequences when expectations aren't met, and holding everyone accountable.
So it's not just about saying, don't do this, but also giving positive guidance and clear consequences.
Exactly. It's about creating a system that supports good behavior and discourages the stuff that led to the conflict in the first place.
This all makes sense, but it sounds like a lot of work. Is it really worth all that effort?
Here's the thing. By taking these proactive steps after a conflict, you're not just fixing the immediate issue, you're creating a better work environment for the long term, preventing future conflicts, building trust. It's an investment, really.
Okay, I see your point. Prevention is better than cure. But before we move on, I want to go back to something we mentioned earlier, the idea that conflict can be a good thing.
Oh yeah, that's one of the most interesting things about conflict, right? When it's handled well, disagreements can be a huge opportunity for growth, for individuals and the team.
How does that work? How do we go from conflict to growth?
Well, when people disagree, it often means they care about something. They've got different ideas, different perspectives, and that can be incredibly valuable.
So instead of seeing conflict as a threat, we can see it as a chance to learn and grow.
Exactly. The article talks about 3 areas where conflict can lead to positive outcomes: driving innovation, strengthening relationships, and personal development.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about each of those. How can conflict drive innovation?
Well, when people challenge each other's ideas, it pushes everyone to think more critically, more creatively. Remember that project team. Imagine if instead of shutting down dissenting opinions, the project manager encouraged everyone to brainstorm solutions to that deadline issue. That could lead to new ideas about streamlining things, maybe even reevaluating the scope of the project.
Like that saying, iron sharpens iron.
Yeah, exactly. Conflict can refine our ideas, push us to think outside the box.
Okay, what about strengthening relationships? That seems a little counterintuitive.
I know, right? But when conflict is resolved effectively, it can actually build trust and respect. Like imagine two colleagues who've been butting heads. They finally have a conversation, see each other's point of view, and find a solution that works for both of them. That shared experience can make their relationship stronger.
It's like going through a tough challenge together. You come out the other side stronger.
Exactly. And then there's personal development. Conflict can be a chance for self-reflection. We see how we react under pressure, what our strengths and weaknesses are.
We become more self-aware.
Exactly. And that helps us find better ways to handle disagreements in the future. Like, maybe you realize you get defensive when someone criticizes you. Once you know that, you can work on taking a step back, breathing, and responding more thoughtfully.
This is really changing how I think about conflict.
In the Community Insights section in the article, it really reinforces this idea.
What do they have to say?
One quote that stuck with me was, "Conflicts are a reflection of a team's culture, and culture is integral to strategy. What shapes culture? Structure. Often, conflicts are embedded in how the team is structured."
So it's not just about individuals, it's about the systems that are in place. Like a poorly designed building is more likely to have problems no matter who's living in it.
Exactly. Another one was, "Preventing conflict starts with clearly defining conditions up front. Honest communication, backed by consistent action, builds leadership credibility."
So clarity and consistency are key.
Absolutely. These insights show that managing conflict, it's not just about individual skills. It's about creating a culture of open communication.
This has been so helpful. We've covered so much. The root causes of disagreements, emotional intelligence, setting boundaries. And I really love that idea that conflict can be a positive force.
It's been great exploring this with you. Conflict management is such an important skill, for leaders especially, but really for anyone who wants to build better relationships.
You're so right. It's relevant for everyone, not just at work.
Absolutely. And before we wrap up, I think it's important to mention that not all conflicts are the same. There are situations where things go beyond just everyday disagreements.
What do you mean?
I'm talking about things like harassment, discrimination, anything that crosses ethical or legal lines. Those are not situations to be managed through conversation.
So what do you do in those cases?
Escalate them immediately. Report it to HR. Depending on how serious it is, you might even need to end the relationship with the person responsible.
Makes sense. Protecting everyone's safety and well-being has to come first.
Absolutely. There's a big difference between dealing with everyday conflicts and addressing something that's truly harmful.
That's a really important distinction. So let's shift gears a bit. For our listeners who want to improve their conflict management skills, what's a small but impactful step they can take this week?
That's a good question. One thing you could try is, next time someone expresses a different opinion, really try to listen. Truly listen. Don't interrupt, don't jump in with solutions, don't get defensive. Just focus on understanding their point of view.
That sounds so simple, but I bet it's harder than it seems.
It probably is. And remember that tip about paraphrasing? It can be so helpful. You make sure you're on the same page. It can de-escalate the situation.
That's a great reminder. Or maybe the step you take this week is to think about your own emotional triggers before you go into a tough conversation.
That's a good one. When you're aware of your triggers, you can manage your reactions better.
Right. Or maybe it's about having that honest conversation with a colleague that you've been putting off.
Sometimes that's the bravest thing you can do.
There are so many possibilities. The important thing is to start somewhere. Take action, keep learning, keep growing. Conflict is a part of life. It's not something to be afraid of. It's a chance to learn and build stronger relationships.
I love that.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into conflict management, I want to bring it back to our listeners. We've covered so much about how conflict can be both a challenge and an opportunity, but, it's one thing to understand it, it's another thing to actually, do something about it.
Totally agree. Knowledge is only power when you actually use it, right?
Right. So what's one small but impactful thing our listeners could do, like starting this week, to improve their conflict management skills?
That's a great question. Well, it could be as simple as really committing to listen the next time someone disagrees with you. Like, really listen. Don't interrupt. Don't jump in with solutions. Don't get defensive. Just try to understand their perspective.
I love that. It sounds so simple, but I bet it's harder than it sounds.
It probably is. And remember that tip about paraphrasing. That can be really helpful. Make sure you're both on the same page. It can really help to de-escalate things.
Right. That's a good reminder. Or maybe this week you take some time to think about your own emotional triggers before you head into a tough conversation.
Oh, that's a good one. If you're aware of your triggers, you can manage your reactions so much better.
Exactly. Or maybe it's about finally having that honest conversation with a colleague that you've been putting off.
Sometimes that's the bravest thing you can do.
So many possibilities. But the important thing is just to start somewhere. Take that first step. Keep learning, keep growing. Conflict is just part of life, you know? It's not something to be afraid of. It's a chance to learn, to grow, and to build better, stronger relationships.
I love that. That's a great way to put it.
Well, this has been such an insightful deep dive. Really glad we had the chance to explore this topic together.
Me too. And to all our listeners out there, thanks for joining us on this journey into the world of conflict management. We hope you've learned something valuable, something you can actually use to, handle disagreements more effectively.
Absolutely. And remember, even small changes can make a big difference, creating a more harmonious and productive environment for yourself and everyone around you.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.